Hello students. Students, in the previous session we have studied about the respiratory tract. That means we have studied about all the structures that are involved in the respiratory tract, along with which we have also studied the functions of those structures. That means what structure in the respiratory tract performs what function. So today, in today's session, we'll first revise the respiratory tract once again, and then we will move to the next part of this chapter where we'll be studying the mechanism of respiration. So we started studying the respiratory tract by studying the external nares and the nasal chamber of humans. So in this we studied that the external nares, like we have two external nares that leads to a passage which is known as the nasal chamber or the nasal cavity. Now the lower region of this nasal chamber or the nasal cavity is known as the palate. The nasal chamber or the nasal cavity is divided into three regions. There is vestibular region or the vestibular chamber, respiratory chamber, and the olfactory chamber. The vestibular chamber, it functions as for the filtration of air. That means it is lined by hair and mucous membrane, and this hair and mucous membrane, it actually traps all the dirt and all the impurities, leading the pure air inside to the lungs. After the vestibular chamber, the next chamber is the respiratory chamber. Respiratory chamber is also lined with mucous membrane, and along with mucous membrane it is highly vascular. That means it has good supply of blood. Now if we speak about the function of the respiratory chamber, it acts as an air conditioner. Okay, now to understand this, how it acts as an air conditioner, let us see two situations. One, if we inhale cold air. So if we inhale cold air and that air directly reaches our lungs, that cold air may damage the lungs. Now what we need is a little warm air that will not damage or injure the lung. In such case, the blood capillaries that are present in the respiratory chamber, they radiate heat. Now when these blood capillaries, they radiate heat, the cold air is now warm, and this warm air can be taken in without any damage or injuries. The second situation is when we inhale warm air or hot air. Now in this case, if we inhale too warm air or too hot air, this can again cause some damage or injuries to the lungs. In such case, the respiratory chamber, it increases the mucus secretion, and as the mucus secretion increases, the moisture from the mucus, it actually evaporates the heat from the warm air, leaving the air cold or a little cooler than the warmer one. Now once the air is cool, this air can be taken in easily and it will not cause any damage or any injury to the lungs. The third chamber is the olfactory chamber, which is responsible for the sense of smell. Okay, so this olfactory chamber, it is lined with a sensory muscle or a sensory membrane which is known as cnidarian membrane. This membrane is made up of olfactory cells, and these olfactory cells are actually responsible to take the sense of smell. After this, we studied about the nasal chambers having three membranous folds, and these three folds are known as concha or turbinals. So there is inferior concha, or which is also known as maxilloturbinal. Then there is lateral concha, which is also known as ethmoturbinal, and there is superior concha, which is also known as nasoturbinal. Now out of these three conchas, the inferior and the lateral one, it is lying in the respiratory chamber, whereas the superior concha, it lies in the olfactory chamber. Now talking about the function of these concha or the membranous fold, it actually is helpful in increasing the surface area. Now suppose it increases the surface area of the respiratory chamber. That means the respiratory chamber will become more rich with mucous membrane and more rich with blood supply. Okay. Then, and if the olfactory chamber, the surface area of the olfactory chamber increases, it will have a longer olfactory membrane to perceive more smell. So in both the cases, it is actually increasing the surface area of the nasal cavity. Then we also studied about larynx, that is the next part. So larynx, or the voice box, which is also known as Adam's apple, they are made up of 4 cartilages. There is thyroid cartilage, there is cricoid cartilage, and there is arytenoid cartilage. Now thyroid cartilage is 1 in number and it is the biggest cartilage. The cricoid cartilage is again 1 in number, and arytenoid cartilage are 2 in numbers and they are the smallest. So 1 of thyroid, 1 of cricoid and 2 of arytenoid, it makes up to 4. So that is how the larynx is made up of these 4 cartilages. Now internally, larynx, it is lined up by a ciliated columnar epithelium, and these cartilages actually are helpful in supporting the larynx. So the thyroid cartilage, it supports the front of the larynx. So it actually supports the upper and the lower front of the larynx. The cricoid cartilage is a ring-like cartilage and it actually supports the lower part of the larynx. Okay. And the third one, that is the arytenoid cartilage, is a triangular pyramidal shaped cartilage that supports the back of the larynx. So it supports from the back side of the larynx, but it does not support it entirely. Some part of it is supported. Now, on the anterior side of the larynx, there is a leaf-like flap which is known as epiglottis. Now this epiglottis, it guards the glottis. What is glottis? Glottis is the opening of the trachea. So the function of this epiglottis, which is a leaf-like flap on the glottis, is preventing the entry of food into the trachea, which is the the windpipe. Trachea is the windpipe. So when we are swallowing the food should not enter the windpipe, but it should enter the food pipe, that is the esophagus. So this guarding or preventing the entry of food into the trachea or the windpipe is done by the epiglottis, which is a flap on the glottis. Then we studied about trachea and bronchi. So trachea, it is a long tube which is 10 to 12 centimeters in length, and it is lined by ciliated epithelium again. And it is supported by C-shaped cartilaginous rings. Now these C-shaped cartilaginous ring or the tracheal ring, they are connected only on the anterior side. That means on the posterior side, it is completely free. So that is how it is a C-shaped ring which only connects the anterior side. Why is it not connected to the posterior side? Because at the back, that is at the posterior side, is the esophagus, and then there is also the vertebral column. So that is how the tracheal cartilage, it only supports the anterior, that is the front side, with a C-shaped cartilage and not the back side. Now these rings of cartilage, that is the C-shaped cartilage, it varies in number. So there are about 16 to 20 C-shaped cartilage throughout the trachea. Now inside the trachea, there are also certain mucus glands. And again, the function of this mucus gland is to trap the unwanted particles when we breathe in the air. So the unwanted particles in the air is actually trapped by these mucus gland, and it prevents the unwanted particles entry into the lungs. Next, we studied about the further division of trachea. So further, the trachea is divided into 2 branches, which is known as the primary bronchi or the primary bronchus. There is a difference between the right and the left bronchus. The right bronchus is 2.5 centimeters long, wider, and they are more vertical. Whereas the left one is 5 centimeter long, they are more narrower and they are more horizontal. Now both the bronchi, that is both the primary bronchi, are lined with this C-shaped cartilaginous ring. So the cartilaginous ring is not only in the trachea, but it is also in the further division of the trachea, that is the bronchi. So the primary bronchi, it enters into each of the lungs. And when we talk about the lungs are triangular in shape. That means they are conical on the upper end and they are wider at the base. Okay. So both these primary bronchi, each bronchi, it enters into each of the lungs. That is the right lung and the left lung. Now each lung is divided into 3 lobes: superior, middle and lower. The right lung is having these 3 lobes, that is superior, middle and lower, whereas the left lung is having only 2 lobes, that is the superior and the inferior one or the lower one. Now the 3 branches of the primary bronchi, the 2 branches of the primary bronchi, they further divide, forming 3 branches, and then they enter into each lobe of the lung. So you can say in the right lung, there are 3 branches of the primary bronchi, whereas in the left lung, there are 2 branches of the primary bronchi. And these divided bronchi, now they are known as secondary bronchus or the secondary bronchi. Now there is also a depression in the left lung. So if in the left lung, if you see, there is a depression on the outer side. This depression is known as the cardiac notch. And this depression is actually because the heart is located at that position. So because the heart that is located in between the 2 lungs, it is more towards the left side, it actually causes that depression which is known as the cardiac notch. And below the lung, there is this muscular membrane present which is known as diaphragm. And this diaphragm, it actually functions to separate the thoracic cavity, that is the cavity where the lung is located and the trachea and the bronchi are located. It separates that cavity from the abdominal cavity. Okay. So this is the function of the diaphragm, that is separating the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. Next we studied about lungs. So each bronchus, that is each of the primary bronchus, it leads into the lungs and it gives rise to the secondary bronchus. Further, the secondary bronchus also keeps on dividing. Now each lung is triangular structure. That means the upper end is conical whereas the lower end is wider. Now the left lung is smaller and the right one is a little wider. And the bronchi that enter into the lung, they enter through the hilum. So the entry of the bronchi into the lungs, that area is known as the hilum. Now if we do the comparison between the right and the left lung, the right lung is divided into 3 lobes, that is superior, middle and inferior, whereas the left lung is having only 2 lobes, that is the superior and the inferior one. The right lung is also bigger and it weighs about something, you can say approximately 620 grams, whereas the left lung is smaller and it weighs about 560 grams. So this is the comparison between the basic comparison between the right and the left lung. Now both the lungs, they are surrounded by 2 layers, that is a double membranous layer. The inner membrane, now this layer is known as pleura. So the inner membrane is known as the visceral pleura, whereas the outer membrane is known as the parietal pleura. And in between these 2 membranes, there is a fluid which is known as the pleural fluid. Now there is certain functions that the pleural fluid performs. The first function is that it acts as a lubricant. Okay, so it acts as a lubricant between the 2 layers or the 2 pleuras. The second function is it protects the lung from the mechanical shock. So suppose there is some injury, okay, with an external injury on the chest. So this fluid, it actually protects the lungs from the mechanical shock. It also holds both the membranes together. So it does a function. The third function is holding both the membranes, that is the visceral as well as the parietal membrane together. In the left lung, there is a depression, that is the cardiac notch, which we have seen. Now in this picture, you can very clearly see the heart located, which is more towards the left side, and that is how there is a cardiac notch. Now, studying about the internal structure of the lungs, this is also we have done in the last session. The primary bronchi enters into the lung and divides into branches. Each branch enters into each lobe of the lung, and the right lung is now having 3 branches, the left lung is having 2 branches. So there are 2 of the primary bronchi that enters into the lung, and into each of the lobes there are secondary bronchi or the secondary bronchus. So there are 2 secondary bronchus in the left lung and the 3 secondary bronchus in the right lung. And then these secondary bronchus, they lead into tertiary bronchus. So the tertiary bronchus in the right lung is about 10 in number, whereas in the left lung there are about 8 tertiary bronchus. Now the tertiary bronchus, they further divides into bronchioles. So now let us study about the bronchial intercom. Now it is a network of branching and rebranching of the primary bronchi. So when the primary bronchi enters into the lungs, they divide and redivide. That means they branch and rebranch. So the bronchial intercom is nothing but a network which is due to the branching and rebranching of the primary bronchi. So by now we have understood that the primary bronchi, it leads to secondary bronchi, and then secondary bronchi, it divides into tertiary bronchi. Up to this division, there are cartilaginous rings present. Now after this, when the tertiary bronchi, it divides into certain narrower tubes which are known as bronchioles, there are no cartilaginous rings present now. These bronchioles are 1 mm in diameter and they are without the cartilaginous rings. The bronchioles further divide into terminal bronchioles, and then these terminal bronchioles further divide into respiratory bronchioles. And each of the respiratory bronchioles have the alveolar sac. So these alveolar sacs are made up of alveolus. So the circular structures that you see in the alveolar sac are the alveolus. So you can say from the bronchioles, that is the bronchioles, the terminal bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles, and the alveolar sac, this whole structure or this whole branching is known as the lobule. Now we have also studied the detailed structure of alveolus. I am just revising over it. So in this we have studied that this is where the gaseous exchange takes place. So the alveolar structure or the alveolus, that is one circular portion of the alveolar sac, this is made up of, or this is lined with a simple squamous epithelium. And this simple squamous epithelium is known as the alveolar epithelium. It is moist, that means it is fulfilling the first feature of the respiratory surface, that is it should be moist so that the oxygen is nicely dissolved in that moist matter and then it is taken in easily. The second thing is the blood supply coming from the blood capillaries into the alveolus. So that means it is also highly vascular. The blood capillaries are lined with capillary endothelium. And these two layers, that is the alveolar epithelium and the capillary endothelium, they make the respiratory membrane, and that is how it acts as a gaseous exchange between the two. So alveoli are inside of the alveoli, they are also lined with mucus and lecithin that acts as a surfactant. So up till this we have studied in the last session, in the previous session. Now in the new session, that is today's session, we are going to study the mechanism of respiration. So this mechanism of respiration or the breathing mechanism, it is a process of respiration, that is where we are breathing air which is rich in oxygen and we are exhaling the air which is rich in carbon dioxide. So inhalation of the air which is rich in oxygen and exhalation of air which is rich in carbon dioxide. This process is the respiration, the basic mechanism of respiration. Now breathing or respiration, it includes two steps. Okay. The first step is inhalation, which is also known as inspiration. Now this is an active process where muscle contraction takes place, and for this muscle contraction energy is required, and therefore we can say the ATP is required. Whereas exhalation, that is the second step, or which is also known as expiration, here this is a passive process. Your muscles, they do not contract, the muscles are relaxed over here. And because the muscles are relaxed, there is no energy required, and therefore there is no ATP required. So breathing includes two steps, inhalation and exhalation. Inhalation is an active process where muscle contraction takes place and therefore energy is required, whereas exhalation is a passive process where muscles are relaxed and therefore no ATP is required or no energy is consumed. Now let us study further, in detail about these two steps, that is inhalation and exhalation. Now inhalation, when we talk about inhalation, there are two inspiratory muscles or two muscles which are involved in inhalation included in this step. The first muscle is the diaphragm, which actually separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity, and the second muscle is the external intercostal muscle. Now what are external intercostal muscle? Now these are the ribs, okay? So there are about 12 pairs of ribs, and in between these 12 pairs of ribs there are these muscles, the red part that you see. These are the muscles which are known as the intercostal, the external intercostal muscle. Now at the time of inhalation, the lungs are tightly packed in the thoracic cavity. Okay, so the lungs are tightly packed in the thoracic cavity. That means they are guarded by the ribs at the side and the diaphragm at the bottom. The diaphragm is dome shape with peripheral muscle attached on the rib cage and at the vertebral column. So here if you see this yellow nerve which is coming, this is nothing but the peripheral muscle. This peripheral muscle, it actually attaches the dome shaped diaphragm from the vertebral column. Okay, so the lungs which is tightly packed in the thoracic cavity is guarded by the ribs at the side and the diaphragm at the bottom, and the diaphragm which is dome shape is actually attached to a peripheral muscle which is attached to the rib cage and the vertebral column. So this peripheral muscle that is attached to the rib cage and the vertebral column, this is known as phrenic muscle or the radial muscles, and the intercostal muscles are present between the ribs that we just spoke about. So I have already told you all that there are 12 pairs of ribs, and in between these 12 pairs of ribs there are 11 pairs of the external intercostal muscle. Now what happens during exhalation? Now when the phrenic muscles they contract, the diaphragm they become flat. So when the diaphragm is this dome shape, now when the phrenic muscle contracts, it becomes flat. And now as the diaphragm becomes flat, the volume inside the thoracic cavity increases. So here if you see, the volume of the thoracic cavity increases. So the contraction of the external intercostal muscle, the rib cage moves up and comes out, increasing the volume of the thoracic cavity. So two things are taking place simultaneously. The phrenic muscles contracting, because of which the diaphragm which was dome shaped now becomes flat, and contraction of the intercostal muscle because the rib cage moves up and it comes out. Okay, it comes a slightly out. This results into increase in volume of the thoracic cavity. Now when the volume increases in the thoracic cavity, when the volume of the thoracic cavity increases, the pressure inside the lungs, it decreases. Okay, and this pressure decreases by -2 to -6 mm of mercury. Okay, now this pressure is in minus, and this is in comparison to the atmospheric pressure, and because of this the air from the higher pressure, that is the atmosphere, is taken into the lower pressure, which is the lungs. This process is known as inhalation. So what happens in inhalation? Once again, the phrenic muscles contract, because of which the diaphragm becomes flat, and the contraction of the external intercostal muscle, that is the rib, moving upwards and coming out. This increases the volume of the thoracic cavity. Now, as we know, the volume increases, the pressure also increases, and here the pressure is increasing inside the lungs. Okay, the pressure inside the lungs, the pressure volume increases, the pressure decreases. So the pressure is actually decreasing inside the lungs by -2 to -6 mm of mercury. Now, because of this, the air from the higher pressure, that is from the atmosphere, is taken to the lower pressure, that is the lungs. This process is known as inhalation. Now next, let us speak about exhalation. In exhalation, no muscle contraction takes place. Okay, so here the radial muscles, they relax. That means the diaphragm becomes dome shape again. Once the radial muscles relax, and the rib cage comes back to its original position, and the intercostal muscles, they also do not contract, they relax. The diaphragm becomes dome shape again, that means it comes back to its original position. The volume of the thoracic cavity now decreases. Now, as the volume of the thoracic cavity decreases, the pressure inside the lungs increases. And as the pressure inside the lungs increases, the air moves outside. Now again, the air is moving from the higher pressure to the lower pressure. So here the higher pressure is what? It is inside the lungs, and lower pressure is where? Inside, in the atmosphere. So the air from the lung is moving out in the atmosphere. This process is known as exhalation. Once again, what happens in exhalation? The muscles contract. Okay, the radial muscle, that is also known as the phrenic muscles, they relax. The muscles do not contract, and the radial muscles relax. And as the radial muscles relax, the diaphragm comes back to its original position, that is it becomes dome shape. The rib cage also comes back to its original position, and the volume inside the thoracic cavity, now what happens? It decreases. As the volume decreases inside the thoracic cavity, the pressure inside the lungs also increases. Now the pressure increases inside, that means the pressure has to be released outside. So what happens over here? The air from the lungs, that is the air from the higher pressure, it moves outwards. So therefore the air moves out into the area of lower pressure, and here it is without any muscle contraction. This process is known as exhalation. Now after the mechanism of breathing, we have to learn certain abbreviations and certain terms which are included in this mechanism. So these abbreviations and these terms, they come under pulmonary air volume or the lung capacity. So when we have to understand the lung capacity, we have to understand these abbreviations and these terms. So the first term is tidal volume, and the abbreviation is TV. What is tidal volume? Tidal volume is normal volume of air that is inhaled during resting position. Okay, so the normal volume of air that we inhale during resting position. Now when I say resting position, it does not mean while we are lying down. It means when we are normally inhaling the air. So this normal volume of air which is inhaled in the resting position is known as the tidal volume, and this volume is about 500 ml. So we inhale in normal resting position, we inhale about 500 ml of the air. Now out of this 500 ml, some air it reaches the alveoli, and some air it remains inside the tube. So some air it remains in the tube, that means it remains in the trachea and the bronchioles and the bronchi and the bronchioles. So you can say out of 500 ml that we breathe in, 350 ml reaches the alveoli, which is known as the alveolar volume, and 150 remains inside the tract, okay, which are known as the dead space volume. So once again, out of 500, 350 reaches the alveoli and 150 it remains in the tract, which is known as dead space volume. Now the second term is physiological dead space. There is a term which is known as physiological dead space or volume. So this is anatomical dead space and the non-functional alveolar space. So if there are certain non-functional alveolar space plus this dead space volume, this is in together, it makes the physiological dead space or physiological dead volume. The next one is inspiratory reserve volume, and the abbreviation for this is IRV. So this is the volume of the air which can be inhaled after normal inhalation. That means, suppose if we inhale normally, that is in the resting position, that is the tidal volume. After that, if we try to inhale more air forcefully, that is the inspiratory reserve volume. That means we have inhaled about 500 ml, okay, that is the tidal volume. Still there is space for more air to come in. So if we inhale forcefully, that is known as inspiratory reserve volume, that is IRV. This is about 2 to 3 liters. So you can say that we inhale 500 ml and then forcefully we can inhale 2 to 3 liters of air more. So inspiratory capacity, you can say, is TV plus IRV. Okay, what is the inspiratory capacity? What is the inhalation capacity? It is tidal volume, that is the 500 ml, and plus the 2 to 3 liters of air that we can inhale forcefully. So this is the capacity of our lungs. Okay, once again, the tidal volume is the normal volume of the air that we inhale in the resting position. Then there is physiological dead space or physiological dead volume, that is the anatomical dead space that remains in the tract, plus the non-functional alveolar space. Then there is inspiratory reserve volume, that is the volume of the air which can be inhaled after normal breathing, after normal inhalation. That is, after inhaling normally the 500 ml, the forceful inhalation that we can do is inspiratory reserve volume. Then there is inspiratory capacity, that is IV, that is TV, that is which is known as tidal volume plus the inspiratory reserve volume, that is the capacity of our lung to take in the air. Next, let us speak about the expiratory reserve volume. So expiratory reserve volume or ERV is the volume of air that is exhaled after the normal exhalation. That means after we have exhaled, we have taken in 500 ml, so we will exhale the 500 ml back. Okay, so after we have exhaled that 500 ml, if we exhale forcefully, if we exhale more air forcefully, that is expiratory reserve volume or ERV. The average volume that is counted for expiratory reserve volume is 1100 ml. Okay, so average volume is 1100 ml. Then there is vital capacity, which the abbreviation is VC. Now what is vital capacity? Vital capacity is tidal volume plus inspiratory reserve volume plus expiratory reserve volume. So it is the maximum or the forceful exhalation, which is 3.5 to 4.5 liters, you can say. See, 500 ml of tidal volume, then about 2 to 3 liters of IRV, and that is inspiratory reserve volume, and 1100 ml of ERV. This goes up to 3.5 to 4.5 liters. This is the vital capacity. That is, it is the maximum or the forceful exhalation that our lungs can do. Next comes residual volume, that is RV. Residual volume is the volume of the air that remains inside the lung after the forceful exhalation. That means after you have forcefully exhaled the air, there are still some amount of air that is still remaining in our lungs, and this is about 1500 ml, that is 1500 ml. Okay, that is the residual volume. Then there is functional residual volume, which is the abbreviation for what is FRV. This is the reserve volume plus the expiratory reserve volume. So you can say about 1500 of 1500 ml of the residual volume, and then 1100 of the expiratory reserve volume is the functional residual volume. Next, we also have to understand about total lung capacity, that is TLC. This is VC. Why VC? Because VC itself is the, it is a sum up of all the capacities. So VC is TV, that is tidal volume, plus inspiratory reserve volume plus expiratory reserve volume. So you can say total lung capacity is VC, that is vital capacity, plus the RV, that is the reserve volume, the residual volume. So the vital capacity, which is in total of all the capacities, plus the residual volume, that is the volume of air which still remains in the air, in the lungs after you have exhaled everything even forcefully. So this goes to about 5 to 6 liters. Average we count as 5.8 liters. So about average 5.8 liter is the total lung capacity. So all the pulmonary air volume or lung capacity is 25 to 30% less in females as compared to males. Okay, and this is found to be higher in athletes. Okay, now we have to also understand about minute respiratory volume, that is the amount of air which is ventilated in a minute. So you can say the tidal volume, that is the normal volume of the air that we inhale, is 500 ml. Okay, that is tidal volume per cycle. And if we count it for 12 times, okay, if we breathe in 12 times a minute, so it is 500 into 12, which goes up to 6000 ml, or you can say 6 liters. So this is the minute respiratory volume. This is in 1 minute that we inhale in. The next one is alveolar ventilation, or you can say, that is alveolar ventilation. So out of 500 ml that we have inhaled in, 350 goes to the alveoli. Okay, 150 remains in the tract, that is the dead space. So this 350 into 12, again we are counting in 1 minute. So in 1 minute, if we breathe in 12 times, so 350 into 12, that goes to 4200 ml is the alveoli or the alveolar ventilation for the gaseous exchange. So in 1 minute, even if we take in 500 ml of air, in 1 minute, even if we take 6000 ml of air or 6 liters of air, it is 4200, that is 4200 ml goes to the alveoli, and the remaining remains in the tract, that is the trachea and the pulmonary, the primary bronchi and the bronchioles. Next, now we have to understand the same thing, all these capacities that we have just learned about, we have to understand it with the form of the graph. So the tidal volume is the 500 ml of air that we take in. Okay, so this is the normal tidal volume that we take in, out of which 350 is it goes to the alveoli and 150 remains in the tract. Then there is inspiratory reserve volume, that means after inhaling the tidal volume, this is the amount of air which still can be inhaled forcefully. Then there is expiratory reserve volume, that means after exhaling the 500 ml, we can exhale more air, that is to an average 1100 ml of air we can exhale more forcefully. That is the expiratory reserve volume. Then there is vital capacity, which is in total of all: tidal volume, inspiratory reserve volume, and the expiratory reserve volume. This is the vital capacity of our lungs. Then after all of this remains the residual volume. Okay, that is the amount of air which remains in the lungs even after you exhale everything forcefully. Okay, there is some amount of air that still remains in the lungs, which is known as the residual volume. So this was about the pulmonary air volume, and then we have studied about the mechanism of respiration. So in the next part we will be studying about this mechanism of respiration or breathing mechanism in further details. So we are ending this session over here, and in the next part we will study about the mechanism of respiration in further details.